Hi there, my name is Rebecca and I'm back for another of our Q&A live sessions all about OET. So if you have a question and you're joining us live through our Facebook or YouTube channel, then for the next hour I'm here to answer any questions you might have about preparing for the test. And I can see that we've got already over 100 candidates joining us live, around 75 candidates joining us from Facebook, so hello to all of the Facebook users, and nearly 40 candidates joining us on YouTube, so hello to everybody joining us today on YouTube. It's lovely to have you all here, and thank you for all of the hello messages coming through. It's nice to see you today, whatever time of day it is for you. It's pretty early for me here, so I can imagine for quite a few of you it's also pretty early where you are, so thank you so much for spending a little bit of your time with me, even if it is either very late in the evening or very early in the morning. For those of you perhaps on the other side of the world, in America and so forth, this may be a much more amenable time, and you are joining in the afternoon or evening. So wherever you are taking OET in the world, I hope you enjoy this session. And as I've got up on the screen, if you have a question about OET that you'd like me to answer, please start typing it into the chat box, and I'm going to start working my way through them. I can see this question. Let me just take that down, and then I can put this question up on the screen. This question that's come in from Omar says, if the cue card or the roll card gives that you have recently examined Mr. X, from where I should start? So on your roll card, and this is true for all professions, at the top of the roll card is a setting statement which tells you where the conversation is taking place. And underneath that is what we call some background information, a couple of sentences which tell you some details about the patient so that you can have this conversation with them. And in that information, it may mention that you have recently examined the patient, in which case you can imagine that the conversation has already started and that the assessors are only going to listen to you from the point as it's mentioned on the card. So you don't need to start with introductions. You could imagine that those have already happened. You can imagine that you have just, as it says, examined the patient, and now you are going to start talking to them about the results, what you found, and so forth. Essentially what it says in task 1. So you could say something like, thank you for letting me examine you. Are you okay with me telling you what I found? Something like that is a perfect way to start that kind of conversation on that type of roll card. Thanks for the question. Litty says, is there any option to recheck the listening answers in computer-based OET? So for both computer-based OET and paper-based OET, listening part A is manually checked, as is reading part A, and obviously writing and speaking. So it doesn't matter that you've typed your answers in computer-based OET, that's still manually checked for listening part A and reading part A. Only listening and reading parts B and C are computer checked because those are multiple choice questions and very straightforward. It's either right or wrong. You've either chosen the correct answer or not. Whereas obviously with listening and reading, there could be a little bit of slight variance, particularly with spelling, so that's why you need to have a manual marker. So if you're asking for remarking, then listening part A would be remarked by a manual assessor, again, a human assessor. Thanks for your question. Let's get down to where there's some new questions. Here's one. Givenchy says, is it okay to use uppercase in all subtests? Yeah, this is a choice. So it's not mandatory. You can choose to either write your answers in more sort of cursive handwriting, which is to use capital letters and lowercase letters, or if you prefer, if you're taking paper-based OET, you can write everything in full capitals. So it's your choice, whichever you prefer, feel more comfortable with. Afia says, how do I identify whether a case is known or unknown in the speaking test? So again, Afia, this should come from the background information, those couple of sentences that I've mentioned on your roll card. And it will say something like, your regular patient has come in for a checkup, or a patient has recently been diagnosed and has come back for advice about lifestyle or something like that. So it should be pretty clear from the background information whether you have met this person before. If you feel it's not particularly clear, then it's fine to make a decision about it, to decide, okay, I think I haven't met this person before, and start the conversation in that way. You're not going to get a severe penalty for doing that, particularly, as I said, if you feel that the roll card is unclear. But in most cases, if there is some previous relationship between you and the patient, that should be very clear from the background information. Ara says, I still don't know how to prepare for the writing section. Please help. So this is a good moment to mention about making sure that you are using all of our preparation materials, and you can see the link for that going along the bottom of the page right now. So on our website, on our prepare page, we have a lot of materials and support to help you with all parts of the test. Things like a 20-minute masterclass for each part of the test to really explain to you what are the key parts that you need to understand of each part of the test. So how long is the test, how many questions there are, how you're going to be assessed, and so forth. There are also sample tests, which of course are really useful to practice your skills. And there are a lot of helpful articles in the OET blog, which you can also find from the prepare page, which cover off usual typical questions that candidates ask us. So for example, for the writing test, if you're not very familiar with using passive sentences, or you don't know how to use articles correctly, or you may not be confident about which preposition to use in your sentence, we've got lots of articles that you can search for in the OET blog. And of course, for writing, we also have our definitive writing guide for OET. And this takes you through each of the criteria in turn that the assessors use to score your writing, and gives you examples from sample tests, how those letters evidence the assessment criteria, to give you some more understanding and ideas for your own letters. Sabi is saying, why is the OET so difficult nowadays? Does it depend on anything, please? So this is a good question, and I like to answer these questions because we know that on social media, these sorts of rumours do spread around, that perhaps a candidate who hasn't got the score that they wanted for their results will then tell other candidates that it's because the test is more difficult these days. But this is a rumour, it's not true. OET is a high stakes test, and as such, it is standardised, which means that each test time, the level of the test is the same. And the reason that I can evidence this is because we are accepted by really important healthcare regulators and government bodies for visa purposes around the world. And as part of the process to get their recognition, we have to demonstrate the standardization processes that the test goes through to make sure that they know a candidate getting a B grade in March this year and a candidate getting a B grade in July this year is actually the same level of English. If there was a wide variety between the challenge of the tests, then regulators and candidates wouldn't be able to trust the OET results that they have received. It might mean that on the ward or in the clinic setting, the regulator or the employer would find that the candidate didn't have the English skills required. So please be reassured that the test isn't any more difficult these days, that provided you have prepared thoroughly and have the correct level of English needed for the result that you want, the test is the same level of difficulty from test to test. Kareem is saying how to enhance my reading skills. So this really goes back to my advice about going to the prepare page, making sure you've visited all of those sites that I've mentioned when I was talking about writing a little bit earlier. In the OET blog that I mentioned, there are also helpful articles about reading. So if you type reading into the search term there, you'll also find a number of articles about managing your time, answering multiple choice questions, finding a person's opinion in a text, and so forth. So there are a lot of useful articles in the OET blog. We'd also recommend our live classes that are delivered almost every day in the week by some of our all-star preparation provider partners. So we have classes being delivered by WLES based in London, Swoosh English also in the UK, TTM English, OET Online, a wide variety of our excellent teaching partners who are delivering live classes, as I say, most days during the week. And you can watch those classes live on our Facebook page or see the videos if you are not able to join them live. And I know a number of those videos do concentrate on tips for reading and other parts of the test, of course. But it gives you a chance to interact with the teacher, to ask them questions. They'll go through some examples, they'll give you some tips and strategies, and you can interact with them in a typical teacher-candidate way. Roshani says, in the writing section, if I have to write blood pressure, do I have to write, for example, the measurement millimeters of Hg, or just 120/30? So in most kinds of test result, you would include the measurements, but it seems pretty standard in the healthcare profession when writing blood pressure results not to include that measurement. So simply 120/30 is, it seems, the standard way, and definitely accepted by OET without the measurement on the end. Bindu says, in OET writing, is it mandatory to write the full name of the patient in the introduction? So Bindu, in my team, the education team, we're obviously trying to teach candidates how to improve their English skills, not just for the test, but also for their new healthcare career in an English-speaking healthcare workplace. And so some of the tips that we provide are directed towards that long-term goal of working and what would be expected of you in the workplace. So the advice that we give is that, yes, it is best practice to include the patient's full name in the introduction, but we also say that for the purposes of the OET test, you wouldn't be penalised by the assessors if you didn't do that in the test. So this is an example of where we're educating you for the future, but it's not something that the OET assessors will penalise you for. So we would recommend you to do what is best practice, while we'll also tell you if it's not something that the assessors are particularly worried about. Vanessa, maybe you joined a little bit after I covered this question earlier, so let me just recap for you briefly. It is your choice. You can use all capitals, uppercase letters in the 3 subtests if you prefer, but I want to reinforce that it isn't mandatory. This is a candidate's preference and choice. I can see that some of you are asking about when will OET have centres in different parts of the world. Jonathan here is asking about Qatar. So we are making more tests available via our computer-based OET mode of delivery. Unfortunately, many of those testing locations, particularly in the Middle East have already booked up for most, if not all, of the rest of this year, because we only have a certain number of seats available, particularly because of restrictions at the moment with coronavirus. And there are obviously a lot of candidates in those locations who would like to take it. So we are working to try and make some more seats available for computer-based testing in those locations. And we'll let candidates know if more seats are added. Sigimon says, is there any easy way to get the listening part C answers? Well, I think the best way that you're going to manage listening part C is by really making the most of the 90 seconds that you have to read all of the questions before you listen to the audio recordings. So in those 90 seconds, my strategy certainly would be to start off by reading the 6 questions without the answer options, first of all, just looking at the 6 questions and understanding what those questions are asking. Now, one little tip I have is some of those questions may be what we call sentence completion questions. So the question doesn't end with a question mark because the 3 answer options are a way of finishing that sentence, to complete the sentence. Now, those questions, what can help to make sure you really understand what the question is asking is either to write it down or in your head to rephrase that into an actual question. So the sentence might read something like, Steve says the best way to vaccinate the population is ... and then there's 3 different options. So I might change that into a question, which is, what is the best way to vaccinate the population? And then I'm really clear about what the question is asking me. So that's a little tip if it's a sentence completion question, to rephrase the question. And that works for reading as well. So to make sure you've really understood the 6 questions. And then I would look through, go back to the beginning, question 1, and look through the 3 answer options, but really identifying in those 3 answer options what makes each one different than the other, and trying to identify maybe 1 or 2 words in each answer option, which clearly shows the difference from the other 2 answer options. And that is what I'm going to then try and hold in my mind while I'm listening, the 3 differences, not the whole sentences and the question, but I'm listening for, is it this, this, or this? And reducing that information is, I think, the best way to then be able to listen carefully and identify which information is the correct information. Kareem says, are spelling mistakes in reading part A considered wrong? Yes, I'm afraid they are. So for reading part A, it does clearly mention on the instructions for the test and in all of the information that we give to candidates on our website that because you are copying your answers from one of the texts, you don't need to make any changes to the text to be able to copy those words into the answer. Spelling is needed to be 100% accurate, and any spelling mistakes either in the paper-based or computer-based OET modes will be considered wrong and you'll score 0. So it's really important that you spend a couple of extra seconds once you've put your answer into your question paper that you do check your spelling is correct. Tijin has a question about clubbing, which means combining 2 test scores. Tijin says clubbing within 6 months is challenging in this pandemic because most exams are getting cancelled. So when this was first brought to us by candidates last year, we contacted the regulators, the nursing regulators that accept clubbing scores, predominantly the NMC in the UK and APRA here in Australia. And what they said to us was, that they will take it on a case-by-case basis. They understand that exams have been delayed and the 6 months limit isn't possible in all cases. So their recommendation was to continue to take your test, get the scores that you need, and then contact them. And they will, as I say, take your results on a case-by-case basis and potentially accept your results, even if it's outside the 6 month usual time limit. So please do get in touch with the regulator for those kinds of questions. Anjum says, in writing, which date should be written at the start? So Anjum, this is fairly straightforward. If you're looking at official OET case notes, which, as I've mentioned, you can find on the prepare page of our website, you will notice that in those case notes at the top in the notes section, you'll find a sentence which says, assume that today's date is, and it will give you the date in that sentence. And that is the date that you will use at the top of your letter with the address. So for test day, that sentence could be the same day that you're taking the test, or maybe 1 or 2 days after. But that is the date, whatever that date is that's written in that sentence, which starts, assume that today's date is, that's the date that you will use for your letter. Amir says, is it possible to consider 2 answers right in reading part C? I can understand that a lot of candidates struggle to distinguish between which is the correct answer from 2 in reading part C, but I can also assure you that only 1 answer is correct. There will never be the possibility of 2 answers being correct. 1 answer will be the best summary of the information provided in the text that you're looking for, will most directly answer the question. So you do need to make a decision, and where you have 2 answers that you think both could be correct, look again at the difference between those 2 options and really carefully check the text to prove that one answer is the correct one and the other answer is not mentioned in the same amount of detail or to be correct. Sorry, I've lost my spot again. Oh, hang on. All right. Here we go. This was the question I was looking for. Jones says, in OET writing, is it right to address a minor less than 18 years by their first name? Can that also apply to a patient in their 20s or 30s? So the advice that we give is if a patient is 16 years or younger, then to use their first name only is appropriate. Any patient aged 17 years or older is generally in a hospital setting, considered an adult, and so using their title and family name would be suitable there. It is possible to use the patient's first name only, even if they are 17 years or older, if you have been treating this patient for a very long time, you have a long-standing relationship with them. So as you've mentioned, if they're in their 20s or 30s, you might use their first name only. As I said, if you've been working with them a long time and it seems more appropriate to demonstrate that level of relationship with them. Healer says, what is the standard speed for listening? Is it like 1 time in YouTube or 1.25? So the standard speed for listening is actually slightly slower than native speech, but it will be played at 1 time speed, obviously. So we're not speeding up the audio from how it has been recorded, but when we do record the audios, we're also asking voice actors not to speak as quickly as they would do in real life, because we understand that this is a language test for second language users. So although it may feel fast to you, it's not as fast as it might be if you were listening to an authentic conversation on the ward or in the consulting room. Thank you, Kandula, for your question. In writing, formal GP means it's known or unknown. I'm actually not sure what you mean by that question. So perhaps you could explain that and I can try again a little bit later. I've not heard of the expression formal GP. Manju says, which one is best, paper-based or computer-based OET? So this really comes down to two things. The first one really should be your preference. So the tests are exactly the same. The length of each part of the test, the number of questions that you answer, in fact, the questions that you see on your paper test or your computer test are the same. So there's no difference in terms of challenge or difficulty. You'll get your results at the same time. But it just really comes down to your preference for how you submit your answers. Are you somebody that prefers handwriting, or are you quite comfortable typing your answers? You don't need to have very fast typing skills. You don't need to be able to type any faster than you can write. So this is something for you to make a decision about which one would be personally the best option for you. The second consideration can come down to availability of the test. And for some of you, you may have a particular deadline to reach. And so it may be that one mode of delivery has availability at the time that you want to take the test that the other one doesn't. So it may be that that sort of pushes your decision a little more than otherwise. But I would still make my final decision, if I were you, based on my own personal preference. I wouldn't particularly take another mode of the test if I didn't feel so comfortable with it, because obviously on test day you want to feel really comfortable and confident about your skills. So from our opinion, either version of the test is equally good. It just really comes down to your own preference. Omar says, do I need to put a comma after Dear Dr. X? So it's fairly standard in letters these days to use what we call open punctuation, which means not to include the comma at the end of the Dear Doctor line or after yours sincerely at the closing of the letter either. But it's not something that would be penalised if you did include the comma. Jose says, is presented to hospital correct or presented to the hospital? So Jose, presented to the hospital is correct. The reason for your question may come from knowing that when we write admitted, we generally say admitted to hospital, particularly in British English. That's just one of those things in English that it's the standard phrase when you use the verb admitted that you don't say the, you say admitted to hospital. However, with other verbs like presented, you would use the as is more standard. So presented to the hospital is correct. Hasina says, will there be any changes in OET from September? Why is reading getting more difficult? So I covered this a little bit earlier, that this kind of rumour that goes around from candidates that the test is getting more difficult is actually not true. In particular, in relation to reading and listening, remember that there's no set pass score for each test. The grade boundaries are fluid, which allows on test day, based on the topics and the questions that are asked, are set for your particular test, those boundaries can fluctuate up or down slightly to allow all candidates to get the same opportunity for getting the grade that they want on test day. So there is no difference in difficulty from test to test. To answer your other question, there are no changes planned for OET this year or even next year, and we would certainly announce well in advance, and I mean months in advance, if we were planning any changes to OET. So please be reassured that we are never going to just spring them on you on the test without any prior warning, or even to say next month so-and-so is changing. We would always tell candidates months in advance if any changes were planned. But again, I can reassure you that there are no changes planned this year or even next year. Chris is saying, if I got 340 in reading, is there any chance for a remark? So what I can tell you about the remarking process, and I covered again this a little bit earlier, if you apply for a remark for either reading or listening, only part A will be checked again, because parts B and C of those tests were computer marked in the first place, and those answers are very clear cut, either right or wrong. You either chose the correct answer or you didn't. Now, with reading part A, there could be some slight variance, but again, because things like the spelling has to be absolutely correct, it's very unlikely that two assessors, which are used the first time around, are going to have made mistakes. They're using an answer key from which they can tell if your answer is correct or not. So it is very unlikely that in the remarking process, where two more assessors check your paper without knowing the previous score that you were given, that they will find that there were sufficient questions that the original assessors marked incorrectly for you to change your score, unfortunately. Precious says, my question is concerning writing. The space between yours sincerely and job title is for what? I mean, are we supposed to write anything there, or is it ought to be left blank? So Precious, it's just a blank line. So it's for clarity. Like, we also recommend that between each paragraph you leave a blank line. It just helps the assessor see that you have separated the letter clearly into the separate sections. So we would recommend leaving a blank line between your closing sentence of the letter and yours sincerely, and another blank line between yours sincerely and the job title. But if you forget to do it on test day, it's not something that you will be penalized for. Amir says, why is OET, which is a language test, putting a lot of pressure on time in reading part A? It's a great question. And actually, it comes down to the fact that we are a language test, because to be able to test your language effectively, we have to put you under a time pressure. If, for example, there was no time pressure in reading part A, let's say you could have 30 minutes to answer those questions, the questions suddenly become a lot more easy because they're very simple questions in terms of either filling in a gap, choosing from four texts which information can be found in the text, and so forth. So actually, to test you at the level required by the regulators and employers that are going to give you a job, we have to use time to create the challenge to be at that level. And it's also something that when designing the test, we speak to regulators, employers, alumni, and so forth, and find out from them the type of skills that they feel candidates need to demonstrate. And one of them is being able to quickly find information from written down to be able to take some action on it. And so reading part A is designed to mimic those skills that you will need in the workplace, where you sometimes need to very quickly pick up some information and act on it. Marato says, in writing, how do we differentiate between medication that needs to start with capital letters and with small letters? So often in OET case notes, you will find both the generic name and the brand name provided for you. And from that information, it will therefore be clear which one is the generic name and which one is the brand name. And then you can decide to choose which of those you want to include in your letter and then copy the capitalization as appropriate. If there was a practice task or a set of case notes where only one was given and you're not sure if it's a generic name or a brand name, then simply copy it as it is provided in the case notes. You're not being tested on whether you know the medication is a brand name or not. Libin says, can we use but, hence, therefore, for which in writing or not? Many of them told me these are banned from OET. So good job for asking OET directly. It's always best to check directly with us when you hear these sorts of stories where candidates are saying this is not allowed or this is banned and so forth. Of those connector words that you've included in your question, I would say, yes, you can use all of them, but instead of hence, we would recommend therefore, which is more standard for this kind of letter writing. And I mentioned a little bit earlier the OET blog, which has a lot of very useful articles in there for all parts of the test. If you go to the blog page, and I'm just popping a link to that in the chat box now, if you go to the blog and type connectors into the blog search box, you'll find an article which covers off the recommended connectors and those connectors which are considered more academic, more suitable for essay writing, which aren't recommended for letter writing. Sorry, just having a look. I've got a few questions now being repeated, such as capital letters, which I've already answered. Okay, here we go. Erin, in the speaking subtest, do we have to role play obtaining the patient's name and diagnosis, or are we role playing under the assumption that we've already gotten that information? So, as I talked a little bit earlier, the background information, the couple of sentences that sits above the dot point tasks that you have to complete during your role play, that will give you information, potentially the patient's diagnosis, if that's already been given in advance. It won't ever give you the patient's name, but depending on what that background information says, you could then start by asking for introductions, or if it suggests that you've met the patient before, perhaps ask the interlocutor for their name during the 3 minutes preparation time so that you can start by using their name at the beginning of your role play, greeting them, finding out how they have been feeling since you last saw them, something like that. So it depends on the role card, but the role card should make it clear at what point the conversation is taking place, and therefore for you to be able to make those decisions about what information you know already, and the tasks will tell you what information you're expected to obtain during the conversation. Uzair says, are we given some time after completion of listening part A to recheck or correct some answers? Yes, you are. So the two modes of delivery, paper-based and computer-based, do this slightly differently. If you're taking computer-based OET, at the end of each part A recording, and remember there are 2 consultation audios that you listen to in part A, at the end of the first consultation, there are a few seconds for you to check your 12 answers, and the same at the end of the second part A consultation. You have a few seconds to check your answers before the test moves on to listening part B. If you're taking paper-based OET, you're given at the end of all the audios, all of part A, part B, and part C, 2 minutes to check your answers for all of the listening test. So the time is split fairly differently. You still end up with the same amount of time for checking your answers, but on computer-based testing, the time is split after each audio. And in paper-based, it's collected together and given to you at the end of part C. I can see someone else, Casey, has just asked that as well. Johanna says, can I write on the test papers on listening and reading part, like to highlight the words, etc.? Yes, you can. So again, this is done slightly differently depending on whether you're taking paper or computer OET. So on paper OET, you're not allowed to use any highlighters in the test room, but with your pen or pencil, you can circle words, you can underline words, you can even write a note down if you want to. That's absolutely fine in listening and reading. And on computer OET, you can use the highlight function to highlight keywords in the questions or in the texts for reading as well, if you want to during those tests. Adiyamo says, are we going to be penalized if we write more than 200 words because sometimes we have so much to write about? So the 180 to 200 words that is mentioned at the end of the case notes is there as a guide. It's not sort of fixed and enforced. The assessors are not counting how many words they have written. But what they are looking at in terms of the length of your letter is whether you have wasted any words. And that would mean including information that the reader doesn't need to know about this patient. Or perhaps by using more words than necessary to explain something. So if you have a look at the assessment criteria for writing, you will see that the third criteria is called conciseness and clarity. And being concise is a skill that is really valued in the healthcare profession, and it means providing information in as few words as possible. And the same is true for speaking. Conciseness is valued there. So in conciseness and clarity, the assessment descriptors are looking at whether you have been able to summarize the case notes effectively. And that is a way of demonstrating that you've been able to condense the case notes down as much as possible. If you have written many more than 200 words, it could be that one of those problems exists for you. You've included information the reader didn't need, or you've used a lot more words to explain or to present something than was necessary. You could have summarized more effectively. However, if neither of those are true, everything you've included is essential and you have been as concise as possible, then, as I said, the assessors are not checking your words and it's unlikely to have an impact on your score. Hasko says, and Reshma also is asking a very similar question, that which format should the date be written in? Should it be day first and then month, or month first and then day? So all OET test papers are written using British English standards, and that includes the date format as well. So the date format is presented in the case notes, day first, then month. So our recommendation, even if you're more familiar with the month first format, is to copy the date as it's presented in the case notes, so that you don't, by mistake, make some kind of change or sort of from one date to another not use exactly the same format. So it's better to copy the date as it's presented in the case notes, just to avoid any of those problems. Hasko says, if both age and date of birth are given, which is most appropriate to be used in the letter? So at the start of your letter, in most cases at least, if you're referring or transferring, discharging the patient to another healthcare professional, you will start off with a reference line, what we call the RE line. And that in the real world as well, in the healthcare workplace, is a line that is used to identify the patient for the reader, and something that they can search a database for to look up those patients' details. So we recommend in the reference line, the RE line, to include the patient's name and their date of birth, because the date of birth is something that can be searched and is fixed. The date of birth should be provided in official OET case notes. You can then choose to include the patient's age within your letter if you wish to, and if you feel that would be appropriate. Let's have a look. Sorry, just here's a new question. Neethu is asking whether the spelling mistake for listening test part A is considered wrong or not. So Neethu, obviously we understand that while writing down while you are listening, there is that possibility for error. As we discussed a little bit earlier, you are given some time to check your answers, and that would be sensible to check your spelling as well at that point. We ask you to be as accurate as possible with your spelling. However, minor spelling mistakes will be accepted provided the assessor can understand the word that you have written and it is the correct answer. Unfortunately, if you've written down another word, perhaps an example I can give you is waist. You might have meant the part of the body, the waist, but the way that you spelt the word is waste as in rubbish, refuse. In that kind of instance, then unfortunately that would be scored 0 because they have very different meanings and the assessors can't tell if you understood what the answer was from your spelling. So you do need to be as careful as possible with your spelling, but small errors are accepted if necessary. I'm just going to remove a couple of spam comments. Here's a new one from Isra. If in the speaking test, if the patient is a baby or a child, is it correct if I can tell pretty girl like we do if practice to relieve the anxiety? So Isra, if the patient is a baby or a child, then obviously you will be speaking to the child's parent during the role play. You would never be speaking to an actual child in your role play section. You can obviously say something like that if you wish, as you say, to relieve the anxiety. But what we would say is you don't have to pretend that the child is in the room with you. So you don't need to sort of look into the distance and say, oh, you know, how is Johnny doing today or whatever. You are only needing to have the conversation with the parent. So you might say, you know, what's your daughter's name? And they'll tell you, and you could say, oh, that's a pretty name, and then carry on. But it would depend on the situation. Obviously, if it's a serious illness or an emergency situation, that kind of phrase wouldn't be particularly appropriate. So always think carefully about the situation and whether what you're saying is appropriate for the situation that you're going. Rabil says, will you please summarize the difference between different types of letters in terms of what information to include or exclude? So actually, the approach for what to include or exclude from your letters is the same for all types of letters for OET. So for most OET professions, there are just 3 types of letter you may be asked to write, which are referral, discharge, and transfer letters. And for some of our OET professions, like pharmacists or vets or speech pathologists, there's an additional type of letter they may be asked to write, which is an advice letter. But for most professions, doctors, nurses, dentists, so forth, there is only those 3 types of letters that I've just mentioned. But regardless of whether you're writing a transfer letter or a referral letter, the same approach to what information to include or exclude is to be followed. So very simply, you should ask yourself for each piece of information a couple of questions. Does the reader need to know this information to continue care for the patient? And is this information relevant to the current situation? If you can answer yes to those questions, then you know that you need to include that information in the letter. If you answer no to those questions, then you can omit the information from the letter. And it's as simple as that. And it doesn't matter, as I said, which type of letter you're writing. The approach to take is exactly the same. Joel says, is clubbing applicable for doctors? So it's always worth checking with your regulator for particular information related to your personal circumstances. But our understanding is that clubbing, which means combining test scores from 2 sittings, is only accepted by the nursing regulators. It's not something that medical regulators accept. Linda says, can you please provide direct links to sample letters? So Linda, please visit the prepare page that we've mentioned a couple of times. I'll put a link to the sample test page on the chat now as well. If you go to the sample test page, you can click on the different writing tests. And at the end of the case notes, you'll find the sample letters for each one. Adiyemo says, how do we pick up the original hard copy of our results and how long does it take before we can get it? So OET doesn't actually provide hard copies of results, and part of the reason for this is all of the regulators now expect candidates to share their results with them online. And we have information about how to do this from our help pages. And if you need any further support with that, you can certainly contact customer service who can explain how to do it. But your results are made available through the OET portal where you register for your test. You can view them on the screen. And then, as I said, you can make them available to the regulator that you wish to apply to. You don't need to provide them with a hard copy. Joan says, in writing, will you fail if you forget to write should you have further questions, which is commonly known as the closing sentence? So just to clarify how both writing and speaking are assessed, they're assessed using a number of assessment criteria, and the assessors are looking at your communication overall. So they're not picking out individual mistakes or looking for particular omissions in any particular way. They're looking at how clear overall your communication was to the reader or to the listener if you're talking about speaking. So forgetting to include the closing sentence is unlikely to have a particular impact on the score for your letter overall, provided that the rest of the letter was well written and you hadn't sort of left out other key details. Adele says, why there is no detailed feedback report about the results and score to know our weak points, trying to avoid it in the coming tests, So this is the purpose of the numerical score that is provided to you with your results. Regulators are asking for a letter grade, but the result that you see is your numerical score. And I'm just posting a link again from our webpage, which shows you how those numerical scores balance out with the letter grades the regulators are asking for. This numerical score is there to show you how close or far away you are from the letter grade that the regulator you're applying to wants. And that is the feedback that we're giving you about the strength or weakness of your skills. Like other high stakes tests, we're unable to provide you with exact feedback about your test, but by using that numerical score, you should be able to see which parts of the test you need to work on if you are planning to take the test again. C4 says, I think this was relating to, I saw a couple of messages earlier mentioning that it is Eid in various parts of the world right now, or I shouldn't say various parts of the world, all parts of the world, but for our Muslim candidates. So Eid Mubarak to all of you, and I hope you enjoy the celebrations, even if it is in a more restricted way this year. Let me just find a couple more questions because we are running out of time. Let's go for this question from Chowdhury, who says, in the speaking subtest, is it mandatory unless task does not ask to examine the patient and tell the findings? I wonder if you mean, is it mandatory to introduce ourselves? Chowdhury, as I mentioned before, if it's clear from the background information statements that this is a regular patient of yours, that they're coming in for a routine checkup, for example, then you wouldn't need to do introductions in those cases. But if the background information suggests this is the first time you're seeing the patient, then of course introductions are fine and a normal part of starting a conversation. Cinderella says, in reading part A, if I write part of the answer, do I take a half mark? So for all of OET, reading and listening in particular, there are no half marks available. Your answer is either correct or incorrect. So it's really important that you use time to check your answers before moving on, so that you don't end up with that kind of mistake where you haven't completed your answer and you would therefore score 0. Jojin says, can we see total word count on screen during the writing? So yes, you can see that in the computer-based test, but remember that would be for all of the words in your letter, not just the words that are counted, which is the paragraphs. There's no way of checking the words in your paragraphs using that word count. It just tells you all of the words that you've used in the entirety of your letter. All right, let's find one more question. And this one comes from Anosha, who's saying, is there any difference in writing a simple referral and an urgent referral letter? So not in terms of the information that you would include, but you will find that you would organize the information a little bit differently. So the information that we recommend to candidates about how to organize your letter is that you should organize in order of importance to the reader. Which means putting the information they consider most important at the top of the letter, followed by the next most important information, and so on. Now, when it is an urgent situation, the most important information for the reader is going to be what makes it an urgent referral, what has just happened to the patient to mean that it's now an urgent referral. So the most recent information would go near the top of the letter. For a simple referral letter, there are a couple of different ways you can organize the information. You could organize it chronologically, so starting from the historical information up to the present day, or you could organize it thematically based on types of information. For example, the patient's social history in one paragraph, their medical history in another paragraph, and so forth. So how you organize the letter could be different, but the content that you would include is largely the same. All right. Thank you so much for joining me today. I want to mention when our next chat is going to be. It will be in a couple of weeks' time. Let me just remove that from the screen, and I can pop up the date for the next Q&A live, which will be into August. We're in August already. So Wednesday, the 4th of August, This time it will be evening in Australia, afternoon in the Philippines and India, and first thing in the morning in Europe. So if you are wanting to ask more questions, please do join me again then. In the meantime, if we haven't managed to answer your question today, please do visit the prepare page. As I mentioned a few times, I've posted into the comment box a few times as well. You'll find lots of support and practice materials and information there. And you can also submit a question to us via Facebook if you want to get a question answered more quickly. We will get back to you as soon as we can with the questions that you ask us via Facebook on our messenger page. So thank you again for joining me today. It's been interesting answering your questions, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye for now.